My name is Fernanda, and I want to tell you about the spatial segregation of the red light district in Bogotá and the effects of the regulatory framework on the public space. And I'm going to go through three different concepts for the theoretical framework. I'm going to explore three moments of the case study, and finally, I'm going to explore how I got to the conceptualization to the research methodologies. Okay, so basically, the theoretical framework moved from the social exclusion and the description of the social exclusion to the spatial segregation, and afterwards to the normative models and how they allow certain degrees of marginalization. The social exclusion is going to be explained through the material resources deprivation and the immaterial resources deprivation, making a little stop on the role of public space, because it is a key point on the city, understanding the city. So the social exclusion is understood through the concept of otherness that is based on an image of what should be a respectable feminine sexuality, and it compresses the idea of the prostitution as an idea of deprivation and social disorder that together conceive like the idea of impurity, of what it's impure and what is pure, and it makes a boundary of towards the, well, starting from the moral impurity, that then it becomes physical, and it excludes or separates the society in two parts: a high society, which is characterized by its civilization, sorry, and the low society that is related to the grotesque manners and kind of unacceptable behaviors. Of course, this is a symbolic division and is not expressed especially, just as it is. Okay, so there are two types of deprivations that are related to the social exclusion. One is the material one, and the other one is the immaterial one. The material one is related to land, of course, and in two different instances. The first one is the property ownership. So it's the fact that sometimes people that exercise that perform activities related to the sex industry are not allowed to have ownership of land, and they are usually evicted from land. And the other issue is the occupation of public spaces. Okay, so regarding the specialization of the sex industry, there are four different logics of service provision. The first two are contact or soliciting. One is on the street, and the second one is on establishments. And the other two, the logistics and establishments, are the service provision, but inside private establishments. As an important part of of understanding this process is to highlight the role of public space for the society of the city. So since 90s, there have been major changes in the city through a culture, an inserted culture of transformative urbanism that has promoted the culture of citizenship and aims to express social power through public spaces. This urbanism has led to a lot of urban regeneration plans and a lot of changes in the city. So the idea that was behind this urbanism, promoted by two specific mayors that had their elected periods after 90s, was recreating the city socially and physically. After 2000, there was a legislative recognition given by a sort of decrees that they started to recognize at least the impact of the existence of the sex trade on urban area. So there were three main points that this legislative framework go through. The first one was the recognition of sex industry as a land use or part of a series of activities on the high impact land use. The second one was the special zone of high impact services and the determination of some regulation that was kind of obsolete because it was related to the commercial regulation. And the third one was the listing of the compatible land uses to the high impact land use. Okay, the second way we can understand the social exclusion is through the immaterial resource deprivation. That regards mainly the idea of community, on how this conceptually, of course, community is conceived as an homogeneous unity, and the things that are outside of the construction of the constructed values of this community are perceived as outsiders and are considered also an external threat. That is the case of persons related to the sex industry in this case. The two most evident situations were the CSI enforcement, that was through a petition of guardianship, and the Interinstitutional Control Committee that was created, just taking account the planning office, a public space defense department, and the urban, like kind of a urban renewal venture that is composed of private actors, and neither of them contains any kind of community related to the sex industry. So regarding the way this exclusion is specialized, is through the neighborhood stigma. So most of the time, these areas are considered to be degraded areas, and that are suitable for regeneration projects. Here I name some cases that were also projected to the society area. And in a second level, there's the occupation of public space. That is where the marginalization becomes visible. This marginalization is based on notions of acceptable behaviors of imposed to women, and that are mostly controlled by the surveillance or regulations as the one that society imposed. And finally, to complete the theoretical framework, there are four normative models. There are the regulatorism, the abolitionism, prohibitionism, and the labor model. So the first one present on this area was the prohibitionism, that was a kind that fitted the situation when there was an absence of regulatory framework, because the persons in exercise of prostitution were legally criminalized, and all the activities that profit from this sex trade were also condemned to crimes. And after that, when this legal framework was established, there was kind of a shift that merges regulatorism and abolitionism. So the regulatorism came when the area was recognized and the boundaries were set, and the women in exercise of prostitution were clearly recognized and, of course, pointed out, and in some way excluded from the normality boundaries. And the abolitionism is a different approach that takes one of the institutional actors towards protecting the woman's right. But of course, both follow the idea that the activity should not exist more. For the case study, I'm going to explain three main points of this story. So first, the origin. It started as an activity promoted by the wealthy society on the area, and it was kind of a premium service. But then, some time later, there was a residential abandonment and the emergence of different law dynamics that promoted this shift, as of course physically and also socially, to the decay of the area. So the residential abandonment was caused by the obsolescence of land prices because they had a high cost, but anyone could profit from them. And because when the tolerance zone was declared, this led over many stigmas over the area, and people didn't want to be inside those stigmas, so they moved away. After that, of course, there were a lot of abandoned places, and there were no residential flows or even pedestrian flows at all. So this led to spaces that could be used for different dynamics outside of the law because there were no physical control or surveillance at all. So this was one of the activities that could emerge. And of course, the built environment didn't change, but as it was just abandoned, the spatial qualities of these places were pretty much promoting the emergence of this industry. Mainly, what the regulatory framework did was establish the boundaries of the area. So at the beginning, the goals that were intended to reach were to reduce the impact of the sex industry into the residential areas, as this legal framework was established because of a complaint of a residential community. Of course, another aim was to reduce the outlawed practice of prostitution, and the last one was to stop the spreading of the activity. But at the end, it developed an uncontrolled operation of this industry, and it increases way much the impact of this establishment on the area. And of course, it was pretty much evident on the public spaces, which made the stigmas and the exclusion grow. Unconsciously, this regulatory framework also create these pairs between the community, because it applies this concept of the homogeneous community, which aimed just to satisfy the desires of these historical residents that were, of course, self-proclaimed, because also the sex industry is historical on that area. And they were above the persons that were in exercise of that were related to the sex industry, and the new residents that came towards searching profit of this industry. So at the end, what this regulatory framework did was to strengthen the stigmas. So of course, this area was perceived as insecure and full of outlaw dynamics that were happening, in fact, outside this area. And of course, this perception lead to an actual physical deterioration. Okay, so finally, I'm going to explain how the concepts came to an actual idea of research. So, in closing the topic, what was going to be described was the spatial segregation just on public spaces on the area of the society from the perspective of the regulatory framework in two different levels of influence. First, the impact of the marginalisation on the access to public spaces, and second, the participation on the urban space transformation. So the question that came at the end was, what was the effect of the regulatory framework enforced since the beginning of the 20th century on the spatial segregation that take place in the public space within the boundaries of the society? The hypothesis is that it strengthened the spatial segregation, that it can be evidenced through specific situations. So the first one is the physical accessibility to public space that is going to be limited. The perception of acceptance that, of course, is affected. The third one is the increment on the comparative advantage that some population has on the participatory mechanisms. And the last one is the transformation of these notions of community that will, at the end, legitimize one social group over other one. Finally, I came to an approach that mixes the qualitative research and the quantitative research. The qualitative, through a semi-structured interview, which addresses the marginalization by eviction of public spaces, the perception of acceptance, the community perception, and the description of the social networks This is going to be addressed just for the woman in exercise of prostitution, and the structure that was suggested was three questions. So the one are broad questions in order to identify a profile of the person and establish boundaries. The second one would be set of detailed questions, and the last group would be a set of questions that link the theoretical framework and the hypothesis to the current situation. To provide more clearance and feasibility to the research, a survey was proposed, taking account the women in exercise of prostitution and two different associations that stand for the sex industry and the historical residence. The topics addressed will be the acknowledgement of the participatory mechanism, the frequency of evictions and the actors involved in them, the identification of the social networks, and finally the definition of the social exclusion behaviors. And that's all. Thanks for your attention.